This is not a video that is intended to bash or destroy anybody's attempt at anything, but I do want to share an honest review on a one-star read for me. Okay, let's talk about this book. So, if you have been following my channel for a while, you will know that I read The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron in the month of February. And boy, did I not have no idea what I was getting myself into. So, I have got my copious notes in my good old-fashioned composition notebook. I took myself right back to school, and here we go. So, to start, I'd like to talk about what this book is about in general. So, this book is supposed to be about Nat Turner, who was the leader of a slave rebellion in 1831. This rebellion took place in the Tidewater area of Virginia, and at the end of the rebellion, Nat Turner was caught. The rebellion was basically brought down and did not reach its goal or completion. And Nat Turner was caught and jailed. And while in jail, he apparently gave his confession to someone who was assigned by the court. And that confession was written down and is a historical document that you can still find publicly available. You can also find some of the case information about his case that went to trial, if you can call it that. Nat Turner himself, we actually know not a ton of information about because he was a slave. He was an enslaved person. He wasn't someone that was necessarily standing out whose life was being recorded at that time period for a variety of reasons. William Styron wrote this book. It is a piece of fiction, and he wrote it with the idea of just sort of fleshing out the details because this is sort of more um, folklorish in nature. At least the what we know of Nat Turner tends to be more on the folklore side in general, though there are some concrete evidence of his life that were available at the time this book was written and are still available now. Certainly, there's more information about his life available to us now than even when William Styron wrote this. My expectations in reading this book was that I was really going to be reading sort of a historical fiction and just learning more about Nat Turner and his confessions, and just seeing someone try to piece together what information we did know about the rebellion and Nat Turner in that time period and put it into a fictional work so we could have maybe a more complete story. My expectations, however, were not the same as William Styron's intent. In the author's note, which is at the front of my book, and I should mention that this is the 25th anniversary edition, but in the author's note, William Styron helpfully points out what his intent was in writing this book. And he says, perhaps the reader will wish to draw a moral from this narrative, but it's been my own intention to try to recreate a man and his era and to produce a work that is less a historical novel in conventional terms than a meditation on history. So that was his intent. I appreciated having that at the front of the book so that I had was able to slightly rearrange my expectations. And the vast majority of this rest of this video is really going to be me talking about whether or not I think he even achieved his own intent. But before I get into that, I do want to talk about just what I personally liked and disliked about this book. What did I like about this book? I'm going to be honest. There are a few things, and they were far in between. I did like the writing in this book. I will say that one of the things that came across to me about William Styron is that he is a good writer. I do think he is very capable of telling an excellent story. His writing style was very clear. Even when it felt a little dreamlike, it was usually because there was a dream happening. So even that came across very clearly. And he really knows how to carry a narrative. It was well paced and well plotted in terms of just writing style and ability. So I would say, like, if I was rating just his writing style and ability, I would give him a 5 out of 5 for that. The structure of the novel was also something that I thought worked really well. It becomes very clear very quickly that one of the things that William Styron is also trying to explore in this book is Nat Turner's own motives and why this whole event may have happened. I do think that William Styron is also trying to create enough of the story that might explain why this happened. Because if you read the historical document on Nat Turner and his confessions, one of the things that you will quickly become aware of by the time you've read it, and it's not a long document, is that even though he's kind of asked about what his motives were, he doesn't really explain. You get the sense that he's leading in that direction, and yet the document itself falls very short of having a clear layout of, why did this happen? I'd like to think that nowadays, we've come far enough in society that we wouldn't have to have someone answer, why, as an enslaved person, would you possibly seek revenge or strike out or try and escape your enslaved position? But if you're not sure, I would say the reason is because they don't have freedom. I think history will show that most people who are enslaved will actively seek to free themselves. So, beyond the writing and structure of this novel, I would say the vast majority of it was downhill for me. There are 5 different things that I could point to as being the things that I disliked the most in this book. The first one would be Nat himself, as in the main character of this book, Nat Turner. I did not like him. I did not like his character. I don't think he's actually supposed to or intended to be a likable person. This really surprised me because up to the point of William Styron writing this book, as I think I've already mentioned, Nat Turner was kind of seen as a folklore sort of hero of the people, if you will, certainly in the African American community, but even by quite a few Americans. And that's not because everybody agreed with what was actually a very deadly massacre style uprising, but I think there were a lot of people who understood. And I think in the African American community, he was seen as a type of hero because he was somebody who stood up and attempted to do something about the fact that people were enslaved. I think one of the reasons that I didn't like Nat Turner as a character started with I just didn't like the way he was portrayed, because William Styron does not set him up in the book as a likable person, or certainly not as somebody who could be viewed as anyone's hero. To get more into detail, let me describe to you the overall portrait that was painted to me of who Nat was based on this book. First of all, he is sort of on the verge of crazy throughout the vast majority of the book. And if he's not out and out crazy in the book, he's certainly moody, swinging between one moment being wildly in love with somebody and the next moment hating their guts. He is also celibate in the book, which I will talk about more later, which in and of itself isn't an issue for me, except for the fact that he's probably the most disgruntled celibate I've ever read in a book. In fact, there's one point in the book where even he says, "Gosh, when this is all over, I think I'd better get married." The other thing that surprised me in the book, and I didn't really like, was that Nat Turner was written in the first person. I felt like there was a lot of license taken in what Nat's thoughts were, including the fact that Nat quite frequently mentions what the Black experience is like and what Black people think. For example, he talks about how, well, I know and we all know how Black people think about white people all the time, which gave me pause because I was like, "Yeah, no, I don't." Like, I I don't know that I know any that do. So it wasn't so much that Nat Turner was written in the first person by a white man, it was more that the experiences that he spoke about as a Black person were experiences that, as an actual Black person, I could not relate to at all. Now, that may be different for someone else. There are possibly Black people out there who think about white people all the time, but I doubt it. I don't know how many people in general think about people of another race all the time. But we will also get to thinking about and obsessing about other races a little bit later, because that comes up again in the afterwards. Another issue that came up with Nat Turner as a character was that, to my great surprise, he was extremely racist. And not how you may be thinking, Nat Turner in the book was not racist towards white people. He was racist towards pretty much every other Black person in the book, including his mother, the his best friend, and certainly all the other leaders that he worked with. And that showed up through him calling them the N word repeatedly. That was the word he most frequently used in the book. In fact, pretty much the only person who repeatedly used the N word to describe Black people in the book was Nat Turner. Even the white slave owners didn't frequently refer to people by using the N word. I didn't know what to make of that, but I found that very odd and, not surprisingly, not likable. And that didn't end it at there. He also described the other Black people in the book as being no better than unthinking flies. Their lack of education in his mind frequently made them complete idiots that didn't even have the thinking capacity that you would typically find in a toddler. The final thing I didn't like about Nat Turner as a character in this book was that he had multiple obsessions. He, like he claimed was true for all Black people, but certainly is not, Nat Turner in the book, was obsessed with white people and whiteness in general. It was what he thought about pretty much all of the time, and especially if that whiteness was in relation to a white woman. He was also obsessed to an abnormal degree with white women, in my opinion, and not just with white women, but most especially with white women's thighs. So, if you're the type of person who gets secondhand embarrassment or just finds it awkward to read numerous descriptions about someone else's thighs, you might not want to read this book. Because if you don't like reading about other people's fetish, you are going to probably read more than you ever thought you would about white women's thighs. I mean, it comes up pretty much every chapter. I certainly have never thought of anyone's thighs as often as I did while reading this book. Ugh. So that was Nat, but interestingly enough, he wasn't the only character in this book that I did not like. I also didn't like virtually any of the descriptions or characterization of any of the Black people in this book. By and large, all the Black people in this book were characterized as basically being Sambos. This caricature of Black people sort of portrayed Black people as being childlike and clownish or buffoonish. And you can look up if you want, sort of the original derivation of the word, which was also not necessarily a positive origin, and just how it was used in America and how it came to be this negative caricature of Black people. With one exception, that being Nat Turner, all the other African Americans that are in this book are painted as being childish and buffoonish and clownish, and as I mentioned, without basically any intelligence. Um, a lot of that lack of intelligence is attributed to the fact that they're uneducated, but I think it goes even further than that. Because even people with lower levels of education, maybe no high school education, certainly no college education, no middle school education, even, or maybe completely unschooled, aren't morons. I think a perfect example of this would be Educated. If you have read that book, she was virtually not educated in any formal manner until she went to college. And I think that's a perfect example of how you're not a complete moron, practically incapable of doing anything without a formal education. And there's no reason to think that literally every single African American in Virginia, except for Nat Turner, was a moron. But needless to say, for whatever reason, that was how William Styron felt like he should portray them. I did read in a critique of this book that somebody referenced another document, which I have had trouble finding, where William Styron talked about Sambos in particular, and that caricature, and how he did not actually feel like Sambos were a caricature of African American people, but he personally felt like that it was a character, that there were some African American people who did perfectly fit that description. And so that Sambos were really just how some people actually were. And this is despite the fact that at the time, Sambo was already considered a racial and derogatory term. But basically, he just felt like, yeah, no, there are plenty of African Americans who represent this buffoonish and childish and stupid type of thing. So it's not offensive to write African Americans like that in books. I have to say I disagree. If including characters that were basically no better than a Sambo in his book wasn't enough, that wasn't the only thing that I disliked about his characters. I also had a problem with the fact that some characters in Nat's life who are mentioned in his confession are missing from the book. For instance, his father. His father is mentioned in his confession, and yet in the book, he is painted as being an absentee father and someone that the mother barely knows who Nat's father is in the book. In reality, Nat, his actual life, did know his father for a time and attributes some things in his life to his father. Nat's grandmother is also missing from the book and is basically, we are told in this book that his grandmother died shortly after he was born. And not just that, an incident in Nat's own mother's life is actually attributed to his grandmother instead. And that was the fact that Nat's mother actually tried to kill him at birth rather than letting him be born alive because she did not want to give birth to another human being into slavery. Nat's own mother, as far as history can tell, was actually very aggressively against slavery and was not the type of person who was going to sit down and be quiet about it. Nat's mother in this book, however, is portrayed as a Sambo and a very dim witted woman who just kind of goes along with whatever, including at one point being assaulted by one of the white people on the property, and just not only sort of accepting and taking it, but also pictured as maybe enjoying her own assault? Question mark. And all I can say to that is why? Why would you recreate that? And is that what you meant when you said that you were going to recreate the man in his era? What part of the era was being recreated with that? I don't know, but it was very disturbing. I couldn't understand why he would put that in the book and what purpose he felt like it served. Other noticeable people missing from the book would include Nat Turner's wife. William Styron did feel like it was okay to definitely make Nat Turner celibate, which is not a historical fact or anything that's ever spoken of or known about him. I mentioned that there was this odd amount of sexuality going on throughout the book that I couldn't help question, like, why is this in here and why does this keep coming up? Um, it was very awkward through the whole book, and not in a like I don't read smut and this is awkward. Like it was just awkwardly done, and you just felt awkward about it. It was kind of like watching someone with their own personal fantasies, and you're like, yeah, TMI. Ugh. The other thing that I didn't like that had to do with that was that there was this consistent tie between his sexual desires and religion. Um, in fact, it was hard to separate the two. If God was mentioned, then there was going to be a connection to his sexuality. And if his sexuality was mentioned, then there was going to be some mention of God that came up slightly thereafter. And it was just an odd correlation, like to the point where he would even spend his Saturdays, pleasuring himself so that he could ask for forgiveness on Sunday. Nat Turner, who is presented in the historical documents and in oral history and other history as being a very religious man, is also a super frustrated celibate in this book, which is just kind of a interesting author choice. Probably the final thing that I will mention that I did not like how it was done in the book would be that it wasn't historical fiction in any sense of the word, which is surprising because historical fiction really took off in the 60s and 70s around the time that this book was written. And it just seemed like he wanted to shun all of those norms. Um, there was what seemed like kind of a flaunting of the historical norms and going around them by intentionally leaving out characters. William Styron does include in this book some of the historical document of Nat's confessions, but even that he intentionally leaves out words, such as the words where Nat Turner mentions his grandmother's influence in his life. Well, he can't leave that in the document if he's going to claim shortly later that Nat never knew his grandmother. So he not only reimagines Nat's actual or unknown history, but he actually reimagines history and the documents surrounding it themselves. Another example of that would be that he makes both Nat and Nat's mother house slaves, where that is not the position that Nat held. But it was necessary for him to make Nat a house slave in the book because how else could he get him into a position where he would hate all other black people that he's then going to lead into a rebellion? I'm not sure why, because Nat himself in the book at one point admits that he thinks some people deserve to be sold. This is mind-boggling to me. And that gets into, for me, what I find good and bad about the book. Now, these may seem like very similar things, and in some ways there are crossovers and they are linked. Um, but to me, to say I like or dislike something has more to do with the personal preference. To me, to say something is good or bad about the book has more to do with whether or not these things in the book worked. So, in terms of what was good in the book, that has to do with his writing style and the structure of the book. I think those were good and they worked out well. I thought it told a cohesive story in a very clear manner. In terms of everything that I said I disliked, it led to a lot of things that I think are really bad about this book. Um, and this goes back to what William Styron claims is the intention of this book. He claimed that he was trying to recreate a man in his era. And I don't think he recreated anything. I think he just made something up that was completely new. He departed so far from history and remade it that I don't think this related to Nat Turner and the events in the way that it could have. So I think that was kind of a failure. I think the characterizations in this were bad because on the very bad worst end, they end up being racist characterizations of people groups. Um, on the best end, they're caricatures and stereotypes, which also just isn't good writing. I feel like another problem with this book is that you get just too much of William Styron and not enough of Nat Turner. A lot of this book really does seem to just be angled towards William Styron's personal preferences and taste. Like, honestly, by the end, I felt like maybe William Styron liked white women's thighs. I don't know. It was weird and creepy, guys. I don't know how else to say that. All of the choices that made Nat Turner start out as a very, very racist person made it so that at some point Nat Turner had to come to want to love black people because why else would he risk his life to free them? And then once he finally got to the point where his heart kind of sort of maybe not really changed about his feelings about black people, it seemed kind of unrealistic. Like, really? That's after spending a very long time as a racist person? This is what's changed your mind? I didn't buy it because I didn't think it was sold and packaged very well. So at the end of the day, William Styron, I think, ended up painting the portrait of a leader of a rebellion that was implausible. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe even the character of Nat Turner, as he wrote it, would have actually attempted to lead anyone into a rebellion about anything. Because I just honestly don't think that this Nat Turner in this book cared enough about Black people to do that. Um, really, what he cared about was white women all the time. That was the only thing he cared about consistently throughout the entire book. Additionally, and I guess I didn't really talk about this, Nat Turner also wasn't really like that upset about his life, except for his lack of access to white women. So those are kind of some of my initial thoughts. But because I had the 25th edition, there is actually an afterword to this book. So I was thinking, well, the afterword is William Styron's response to critics of his book. Because this book got a lot of backlash when it came out. So much backlash that there is actually a book published, and I own it, that is 10 Black writers responding to him writing this book. There were people who held symposiums about critiquing this book, and there have been classes that include critiquing this book. There were a lot of people who did not like this book, black, white, and all the rainbows of the world. Um, and so in the 25th edition, William Styron was allowed to write an afterwards, which comes across largely as what is intended to be a defense of what he wrote in this book, why he wrote in this book, and how people just misunderstood the book. So I read the afterwards thinking that it would explain things to me that I was maybe missing. And it did, yet again, not in the way I was expecting. In fact, I think he would have been better off leaving the afterword out of this book because it just confirmed some of the things that I had been thinking. He very much felt like the only explanation for Nat Turner's um, rebellion was that Nat must have been a psychopath who was obsessed with white women because there was no other reason for him to stage a rebellion or create an uprising or try and escape slavery. Another thing that I thought was interesting was there were bits of racism that were attributed to Nat Turner that felt kind of personal to someone else. And I was interested to find in the afterword that William Styron did admit that he himself was racist. As William Styron himself explains it in the afterword, he did grow up in the Tidewaters of Virginia, and everyone in his area was racist. But he felt like he was different, and this is what he said. I fell under the spell of negritude, fascinated by Black people and their folkways, their labor and religion, and especially their music, their raunchy blues and ragtime, and their spirituals that reached for and often attained the sublime. Like some young boys who are troubled by their unnatural sexual longings, I felt a similar anxiety about my secret passion for blackness. I don't claim a special innocence. Most white people were and are racist to some degree, but at least my racism was not conventional. So his excuse is he's a special racist. He's not your average racist. He's racist in that he's obsessed with black people. Okay, sure. Another surprising element I found in the afterwards was he talked about the critics of his book. And without exception, every person who criticized this book, he thought was uniquely an idiot in that moment of criticism. He acknowledged that some of the people who wrote criticisms about his book, including some of the Black authors that were published in that other book that I mentioned, that they were intelligent and very smart people, except when they criticized this book, at which point they were some of the stupidest people he's ever known or met, as was everyone in the New York Times and the New York Book Review when they wrote a negative review. In fact, the only people who showed any intelligence were the people who defended his book, because that's clearly how that works. He does mention that he intentionally sexualizes Nat Turner because that sort of fed into his own personal thoughts about why Nat Turner may have done what he did. Again, because he was obsessed with women. And he felt there was no reliable source of Nat being married, which can be argued, um, or even being involved with a woman, which again doesn't stand up to history, but he felt like that made it all the more plausible for me to portray a man who was a bachelor, or at least womanless, a celibate with all the frustrations that celibacy entails. So that's kind of how William Styron explains the sort of sexual tension that Nat Turner constantly has throughout this book, which is that he's just experiencing the frustrations that every celibate feels. Because William Styron, not being a celibate, knows exactly what it's like to be a celibate, and that is to be full of nothing but sexual frustration about white women and their thighs. He admits that he may have slightly missed the mark on the Black religious experience. In the same manner that a lot of people who defend this work do, he does use sort of the James Baldwin argument, as I call it, which is that he was friends with James Baldwin, and James Baldwin and he spent, I think it was a weekend together just as he was starting to write this book. And he expressed to James Baldwin his hesitation in writing the book as a white man writing the voice of a Black author. But he was very much encouraged by James Baldwin to write the book and to work on it. And so that's kind of his excuse for everything that came out in the book. Which I don't think is much of an excuse at all. I think that's basically just saying, well, I have a Black friend and they thought it was okay that I wrote it, therefore it can't be bad. Well, nope, that's not a logical argument. It can be bad. I could have a friend that tells me to write about a book about William Styron. That doesn't mean it's going to be a good book about him. That's no argument at all. It's just sort of playing the black friend card at best. Like, or you could say it's playing the my friend's an author card. He told you to write it. He didn't say it was good. And in fact, after the book was published, James Baldwin told him, yeah, you're going to get some flack from this, basically from white and Black people. So there's that for your friend. Which brings me ultimately to the question of artistic license. William Styron, in his opinion, because he writes fiction, feels like he has absolute, complete control of, his writing and is not beholden to anyone or anything in terms of what he writes in his book. And therefore, it is good and it is okay. And so I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to talk about artistic license really quickly and my thoughts on it before I get into my rating. I looked up artistic license just so that we would have some sort of baseline as to what is meant by artistic license. I used the Merriam-Webster definition, and it is basically that artistic license is the when an artist is given leeway in interpretation and not held strictly accountable for accuracy. And in William Styron's case, he would say this is just artistic license, therefore it's okay. I, however, would like to look at that definition and point out the word strictly. I think this is a good definition because I think it recognizes that while an artist using artistic license may not be held strictly accountable, it does not mean that they're not held accountable at all, which I think is the fallacy that William Styron fell into. He feels like he should not be held accountable at all for anything that he did in this book. And that I would disagree with. I think we all as artists and or buyers of art or readers of art or consumers of art, if you will, do hold artists accountable to some level. And I think it's just a question of where do you draw the line? And I would argue that the line is drawn with the consumer or the purchaser or the viewer or the reader. Um, and the analogy that I see it as, I think, is easier to see with actual, like, visual art. So, for example, if you took a painting, if somebody came to you and said, I'm going to make a portrait of your mother, um, there's going to be a line in terms of what you're going to accept. Now, you could either be a fan of, sort of a realist or want a photograph even of your mother, and you could go from that all the way to, being okay with a impressionist period or even an abstract artist rendition of your mother, and consider that all of those things could be okay to someone. But my thought on artistic license is that the line is kind of on the side of the person purchasing or who has the paying power. At some point, no matter what the artist says about this is your mother, there's going to be some line that you're not going to cross and that you're not going to pay for. After a certain point, you're going to say, I don't care who you say it is. I'm not buying it. I'm not paying you for that. I want my money back. Um, and personally, for me, William Styron crosses that line. I'd love to have my money back. So that's why I'm giving that a one-star read. And for me, it kind of crossed the line when it became more about his own interest than the character himself. And largely because he gave me the impression that even though it wasn't a historical book, that he was still recreating this man, Nat Turner. I don't think he recreated Nat Turner. I think he recreated a situation in his own mind about something else. Where it truly fails for me is I still wouldn't have believed that the leader he created would have actually led anyone into anything because I don't think anyone would have followed him. Partially because the way everybody else is in this book is they're too stupid to be able to follow him. And he's not the type of person you'd want to follow. Like, there are some people who kind of sort of like him in this book, and I can't for the life of me figure out why, because there is nothing about Nat in this book that is a likable person. I don't think it's enough to just write a book, which is pretty much all that William Styron felt like he was doing. I think there is some level where if I am spending money purchasing or spending time on something, I want to find that I have actually bought what you told me you were selling. And I did not have that experience with this book. So at the end of the day, if you choose to read this book, it's up to you, but I'd have to say I don't think it's worth it. But at the end of the day, that's a question that you have to decide is this interpretation and is the way he writes this book, is it noteworthy? And is it worth your time and your money? If you made it to the end of this video, I thank you for watching. Feel free to like this video if you liked this content and want me to see me do more reviews, preferably on books that I loved instead of books that I didn't. And be sure to leave a comment with any thoughts that you have on this book. I hope it goes without saying that I hope you are kind and considerate and leave constructive comments so that we can have an amazing conversation. I would love to hear from you if you disliked the book like I did, or for different reasons, or even if you loved the book and it's your favorite book. Share why. I would like to know if there are things that I missed or things that stood out to you, or if you even just had a very different experience of reading it than I did, because that is completely possible. So I just put this out here so that other people could have things to think about. I always appreciate seeing long reviews on books so that I can decide whether or not I want to purchase something or just try and get it out on loan, or if I want to skip a book altogether. So that's it for today, and I hope I'll see you next time.